Ye Yun didn't go to the decaying safehouse for love. He went because an anonymous text dropped coordinates onto his encrypted phone, and he didn't trust loose ends. 3 hours before midnight, his maid had vanished. The same woman who knew the exact hour he took his coffee, the exact amount, slipped to harbor police to keep their eyes pointed the other way. He expected to find betrayal. He expected to find her cowering beside a bag of stolen cash. What he found when that rotting door exploded inward stopped his blood entirely. Ruth was there, bound to a wooden chair in the center of a peeling, crumbling room, tears cutting clean lines through the grime on her dark cheeks, her wrists lashed raw with thick rope. The silver duct tape across her mouth caught the moonlight, and beneath it, pressed against her lips, a tiny red LED pulsed. Slow, rhythmic, alive. Then came the sound. The metallic, synchronized clack-clack of 4 handguns being racked at the back of his skull. He didn't have to turn around to know. His own men, his own blood, aimed straight at the back of his head. What Ye Yun witnessed inside that suffocating room didn't just detonate his meticulously ordered world, it made him cancel the wedding entirely. 3 hours earlier, the chalk scratched against the dark wool of Ye Yun's trousers, a dry, abrasive sound that vibrated straight through the fabric and into his skin. He stood perfectly motionless on the velvet pedestal inside the penthouse fitting suite, staring into the tall, gilded mirror. The reflection staring back didn't look like a man preparing for his wedding. It looked like a man preparing for war. The charcoal suit was cut deliberately close to the ribs, tailored to hide the weight of the leather shoulder holster he never removed. Not even for this. Chloe Sterling sat on a plush ivory sofa behind him, one leg crossed over the other, her thumbs firing demands into her phone, without a single glance in his direction. Her blonde hair was pinned into a severe, sleek knot at the base of her neck. She was beautiful the way a drawn blade was beautiful. Sharp, cold, and made entirely for damage. "Ye Yun, you're shifting again," she said flatly. "The tailor needs you still." He didn't answer. The air in the suite was dense with lavender oil and the particular staleness of old money. Tomorrow, he was supposed to marry this woman and seal a transcontinental monopoly. His untouchable Seoul shipping ports folded into the Sterling family's American distribution network. It was a transaction. He knew it. She knew it. They had both agreed to it, with the dispassion of people signing a customs form, and that mutual understanding was precisely why it was supposed to work. But as the tailor drove a silver pin through the cuff of his sleeve, Ye Yun's gaze moved, slowly and almost involuntarily, to the empty space beside the door. Ruth Robinson wasn't there. She was always there. For 2 years, Ruth had moved through his estate like a quiet current beneath everything, unassuming, practical, devastatingly perceptive. She wasn't loud or ornamental. She was the woman who materialized at his elbow before he knew he needed her, who managed the invisible architecture of his daily life with a calm that bordered on unnerving. When his Seoul lieutenants had crowded the corridor last spring, posturing and filling the hallway with testosterone and threat, Ruth had simply walked straight through the middle of them carrying fresh linen, glanced at the largest man, and said, without raising her voice, "You're standing on the cord." He moved. They all moved. She never looked back. She knew the weight of his silences. She knew the precise hour the tension headache arrived, and she knew to leave a glass of water on the left side of his desk without being asked. She was the only constant in a life built entirely on calculated chaos. And she was gone. 48 hours. No word, no trace. When the anonymous text arrived on his encrypted line, nothing but a set of coordinates and the South Side district, Ye Yun stepped off the pedestal before the tailor could protest. "Senor Ye." He shrugged the unfinished jacket off his shoulders and dropped it across the velvet chair. Chloe finally put down her phone. "The wedding is in 2 days," she said, her voice edged with steel. "Whatever this is, I'll be back," he said. He wouldn't be. He pulled his 4 most trusted enforcers from the penthouse lobby and drove south through the midnight rain, expecting a swift, surgical extraction. A terrified woman, a simple loose end, a problem he could erase before dawn. He brought 4 guns and 0 mercy, because that was the only language he had ever known. What he walked into was something else entirely. The scattered papers on the floor of that crumbling, rotting room, The pages fanned out beneath Ruth's bound feet weren't syndicate ledgers. They weren't stolen cash receipts or rival gang intelligence. They were medical documents, toxicology reports, and the name printed across the top of every single page was his. If a dangerous man in a tailored suit and a woman with secrets sharp enough to draw blood is exactly the kind of story your soul has been starving for, you are exactly where you need to be. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now, because this story is only getting darker and you will not want to miss a single chapter. Drop a comment below. Are you team Ye Yun, or are you watching Ruth and waiting to see what she's really made of? Like, share, and let someone else fall into the shadows with you. We'll see you in Chapter 2. The door didn't fall. It detonated. One kick from Ye Yun's boot, and the rotted frame exploded inward, sending splinters of soft, decayed wood skittering across the floorboards like shrapnel. He stepped through the threshold without hesitation, the heavy black collar of his wool coat turned up against the midnight cold, the syndicate ink crawling up his neck like a second skin. The room swallowed him, peeling walls the color of old bone, wallpaper curling away in strips, the ceiling stained brown where rain had found its way through years ago and never stopped. The floorboards groaned under his weight. The smell hit him first. Damp wood, mildew, and underneath it, faint but unmistakable, the iron bite of fierce sweat and something chemical. Sharp. Wrong. Then he saw her. Ruth sat in the center of the room, bound to a straight-backed wooden chair, her dark wrists lashed behind her with rope thick enough to moor a boat. Her hoodie was torn at the shoulder. There was a bruise beginning to rise high on her left cheekbone, deep, purpling at the edges, the kind that came from a closed fist and someone who hadn't bothered to be careful about it. Her natural hair was a wreck around her face, damp at the temples where she'd been crying, and she was still crying now, silently, desperately, her brown eyes wide and locked onto him the moment he crossed the threshold. Silver duct tape sealed her mouth shut. Her chest heaved with the effort of breathing through her nose alone, each inhale audible, ragged, barely controlled. Ye Yun's eyes moved to the tape, and then his blood stopped. Beneath the silver strip, pressed flush against the curve of her lips, a tiny red LED pulsed. Slow, rhythmic, alive. He had seen enough ordnance in his life to recognize the signature, pressure-triggered, wired to her pulse, to the adhesive seal, to the specific resistance of the tape against her skin. If her heart rate spiked past a threshold, the circuit would close. If someone ripped the tape carelessly, the circuit would close. Either way, the detonation radius in a room this size left no survivors. The synchronized metallic clack, 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 clack rang out behind him. 4 distinct hammers, 4 distinct chambers, all loaded, all aimed at the back of his skull. He didn't turn around. He already knew the sound of every weapon his men carried. He had chosen each of those guns himself. A voice he recognized, low, almost apologetic, spoke from behind his left shoulder. "Don't reach, boss. This ends here." Ye Yun exhaled slowly through his nose. The tension in his jaw was the only thing that moved. His eyes stayed fixed on Ruth. She was shaking now, small, involuntary tremors running through her shoulders, and he watched the fear spike in her expression when she registered the guns at his back. Her breathing accelerated. The LED pulsed faster. "Look at me." His voice came out barely above a murmur. Quiet, absolute. Ruth's eyes snapped to his face. "Only at me, nowhere else." He took one step forward, then another. Placing himself directly between Ruth and the 4 barrels at his spine, he reached slowly into his boot and withdrew a surgical blade. 3 inches, single edge, the kind a field medic used for precision work under pressure. He held it where she could see it, an offering, not a threat. He crouched in front of her until they were level. This close, he could see the exact shape of her fear, the way it lived in the tremble of her lower lashes, the clench of her jaw fighting against the tape, the desperate steadiness she was trying to hold for him even now, even like this. There was something else in her eyes too, something that cracked straight through his composure and left a fault line he hadn't known existed. She had been waiting for him specifically, not rescue, him. He pressed his free hand lightly over her bound ones, just pressure, just contact, and felt her fingers curl instinctively around his. Then, with a stillness that had no business existing in a room full of loaded guns, he brought the blade to the edge of the tape, millimeter by millimeter, never breaking her gaze. "Steady," he breathed. "I have you." The blade traced the adhesive edge with surgical patience. Ruth held her breath. The LED slowed. His eyes never left hers. Dark, unblinking, a current running between them that had nothing to do with the guns or the bomb or the midnight rain hammering the roof above them. It was older than that, quieter. The tape separated. The device dropped to the floorboard with a soft, anticlimactic click. Ruth gasped, a full, desperate pull of air, and then Ye Yun was already moving. He spun in a single fluid arc, drawing from the holster beneath his coat in one motion. 3 shots, 3 men. Each one fell before the fourth could fully process what had happened. The fourth, the one who had spoken, met Ye Yun's eyes for exactly 1 second before the last round resolved the equation. Silence crashed back into the room like a wave. Ye Yun stood motionless for 1 breath. Then he turned back to Ruth and cut the rope from her wrists himself, his hands steady, his expression a controlled mask over something that was anything but controlled. She came apart the moment the last knot released. She didn't scream or collapse. She leaned into him, forehead against his chest, shoulders shaking with the kind of exhausted, relieved weeping that a person holds back for as long as the body physically allows. His arm closed around her back, one hand at the base of her skull, pressing her closer with a quiet ferocity that surprised even him. Then she pulled back just enough to look up at him. Her eyes dropped to the papers scattered across the floor at her feet, pages she'd clearly been staring at for hours, unable to say a word. Toxicology reports. Lab formatted. Formal. His name was printed across the top of every single one. Ruth's voice, still raw and fractured from the tape, was barely a whisper. "They've been poisoning you. 6 months. Every morning." The words landed like a blade between his ribs. Slow, clean, devastating. "You have 48 hours. He pulled out his phone before the last echo of gunfire had finished dying in the walls. 1 text, 4 words, no explanation, no softening, no apology dressed up as courtesy. Ye Yun had never once in his life explained himself to anyone, and he wasn't about to start now. The message to Chloe Sterling was surgical in its finality, the kind of sentence that didn't invite a response because the man who sent it had already moved 3 steps past the conversation. He pocketed the phone, looked once more at the bodies on the floor, his own men, turned, bought, aimed at the back of his skull by a hand he hadn't yet identified, and felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the reckoning that would follow. Someone with deep reach had gotten inside his circle. That accounting would come. Then he looked at Ruth. She was standing on her own now, barely. Her dark hands were wrapped around her own elbows, holding herself together through sheer will. Her brown eyes still wet, but her jaw set with a resolve that hadn't broken, even when everything else had. The rope marks on her wrists were vivid against her skin, raw, chafed red, the kind of damage that would take days to fade. Her torn hoodie hung off one shoulder. She looked like a woman who had been through something catastrophic and was refusing, absolutely refusing, to let it finish her. Ye Yun crossed the room and placed his coat around her shoulders without a word. It swallowed her. Heavy black wool, still warm from his body, the collar carrying the faint trace of his cologne beneath the gunpowder. Ruth's fingers came up slowly and gripped the lapels from the inside, pulling it closed around herself. And something in that single gesture, so quiet, so private, tightened a fist around his chest that he had no immediate language for. He got her out of that building before she could look at the papers again. The jet sat on a private strip 40 minutes south of the city, dark and sleek against the wet tarmac, its running lights the only warmth in a sky that had committed entirely to rain. No flight plan filed under his name, no crew beyond the pilot, a man who had been with Ye Yun long enough to understand that questions were a luxury he didn't offer. The cabin was small and deliberately understated. Dim gold lighting recessed along the ceiling, deep charcoal leather seats, the smell of expensive hide, and the rain that had followed them inside on their clothes. Ruth moved through the cabin slowly, like someone whose body was still processing the distance between where she'd been an hour ago and where she was now. Ye Yun watched her settle beside the small utility case she'd asked him to retrieve from a hidden panel beneath the safehouse floor, a cache she had known the exact location of without hesitation. He had noted that. He had noted all of it. He simply hadn't spoken yet. She opened the case with practiced hands. Inside, organized with a precision that had nothing to do with a maid's training, were vials, a compact synthesizer unit, 2 preloaded syringes, and a field tablet, encrypted with a lock sequence she entered from memory. Ruth worked quickly, her long brown fingers moving through the equipment with the focused economy of someone who had done this under pressure before, many times before. The stabilizer took 11 minutes to synthesize. Ye Yun sat across from her the entire time, jacket off now, shirt rolled to the elbow, watching her work and saying absolutely nothing. The toxicology reports lay on the seat beside him. He had read every page twice on the drive to the airstrip. He understood exactly what had been done to him, how long it had been happening, and what 48 hours without an antidote meant for his nervous system. What he didn't yet understand was her. When she finally pressed the syringe to his forearm, her touch was steady, clinically precise, but her eyes were not. They moved to his face and stayed there, and whatever composure she had rebuilt in the last hour began, slowly and visibly, to fracture. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly, "before this goes in, before you decide what to do with me after." He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched her with those dark, patient eyes that had always made his staff deeply uncomfortable, and had, she now realized, never once made her feel that way. Ruth exhaled. She told him everything. Not a maid, never a maid, an NIS field operative, National Intelligence Service, Seoul Division, placed inside his estate 18 months ago to build a RICO case broad enough to dismantle both his American and Korean operations simultaneously. She had been exceptional at it, methodical, invisible, thorough. For 14 months, she had filed perfect intelligence while folding his laundry and memorizing his silences and learning exactly which coffee was his and exactly what it meant when he went quiet at the wrong moment during a call. And then, somewhere between the surveillance and the silence, something had gone profoundly, irreversibly wrong. She had fallen in love with her target. The words landed in the cabin and didn't dissipate. They stayed, dense and irreversible, filling every inch of pressurized air between them. Ruth held his gaze through all of it, through the confession, through the trembling in her jaw she couldn't fully suppress, through the moment after she finished speaking, when the only sound was the rain against the fuselage and the low hum of the engines beneath them. Ye Yun was quiet for a long time. Then he reached across and pressed the syringe himself, his thumb over hers, finishing what she'd started. He felt the stabilizer move through him, a cold thread pulling through his bloodstream, pushing back against the poison with temporary, borrowed authority. His jaw tightened once against the sensation. Then he looked at her. "This buys you approximately 18 hours, Ruth said quietly. "After that, the neurotoxin will reassert. We need the antidote before the stabilizer fails." He moved from his seat to hers in one slow, deliberate motion, and the weight of that movement was not violence. It was gravity. Inevitable, irresistible. His hand came up, and his fingers traced the line of her jaw, following the darkening bruise on her cheekbone, with a gentleness so at odds with everything he was that it stole the breath directly from her lungs. "You lied to me," he said. His voice was barely above a murmur. "For 18 months you lied to me." His thumb brushed the corner of her mouth. "And then you burned your entire life to the ground to keep me breathing." Ruth's eyes glistened. She didn't look away. "Yes," she whispered. The word hung between them, fragile, enormous, and entirely without apology. Seoul received them the way it received everything Ye Yun had ever brought to its shores, without ceremony, without mercy, and without light. The jet touched down at 3 in the morning on a private strip east of the Han River, far outside the jurisdiction of any authority that mattered. Beyond the airstrip fence, the city bled neon into a sky-bruised purple with rain, pink and cyan, and the washed-out gold of 10,000 signs reflecting off wet asphalt in long, shivering columns. It was beautiful the way a knife's edge was beautiful. It demanded your attention and didn't particularly care what it cost you. Ye Yun made it down the jet stairs under his own power. Barely. The neurotoxin had found a new gear somewhere over the Yellow Sea. The stabilizer was holding, but the edges of it were already thinning. He could feel the poison probing those edges the way water probes a cracked seal, patient and without conscience. By the time the wheels hit Korean tarmac, his left hand had developed a tremor he couldn't fully suppress, and the pressure behind his eyes had graduated from a headache to something that felt structural. He said nothing about it. He didn't have to. Ruth was already beside him on the tarmac, her shoulder pressed to his arm, one hand at the small of his back, with a quiet, insistent pressure that said she knew exactly how much weight he was actually putting on her without making it visible to anyone watching. She had changed on the jet, a spare tactical set from the cache, dark and fitted, her locks pulled back from her face. The bruise on her cheekbone had darkened through the flight, vivid and storm-colored against her deep brown skin, and her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone running on nerve and will in equal measure. But her spine was straight, her hand on his back was steady. Whatever fear lived inside Ruth Robinson, it had long since learned to share space with something fiercer. They moved to a vehicle that was already waiting. No questions asked, no names exchanged. The safehouse sat in a narrow lane off Bukchon, a traditional Hanok structure renovated from the bones out, its sliding paper screens replaced with reinforced panels, its warm interior lit by low amber lamps that turned every surface to gold. It smelled of cedarwood and the stillness of a space that had been sealed and waiting. Ruth got Ye Yun onto the low-sitting platform in the main room and immediately returned to the data drive, the encrypted unit she had protected inside her body brace throughout the entire safehouse ordeal, the one she hadn't yet opened because she'd needed a secure terminal to access it safely. She worked at the low table across from him, her fingers precise and rapid across the field tablet, decoding in layered sequences that took 12 minutes and required 3 separate biometric confirmations. Ye Yun watched her from where he sat, his forearms resting on his knees, his jaw tight against the tremor, moving north from his hand toward his elbow. He watched the way the amber light moved across her face, the focused crease between her brows, the slight press of her lips when a sequence resolved, the way she exhaled through her nose when the final layer broke open. Then she went still, the kind of stillness that preceded catastrophe. Ye Yun. Her voice was careful, measured in a way that told him she was choosing every syllable deliberately. The mastermind behind the poisoning, behind the safehouse, behind the men in your unit who turned on you. She turned the tablet so he could see the screen. It isn't the Sterling family. He leaned forward. Read the name at the center of the intelligence web. Read the operational signature. Read the financial routing codes he recognized from a decade ago because he had watched them being constructed by hand, sitting across a desk from the man who invented them. Jin. The name moved through him like a blade finding an old wound, the kind of injury a body forgets about until the exact right pressure is applied, and then remembers with total, nauseating clarity. Jin, his adoptive father, the man who had pulled a 17-year-old street boy from a Busan gutter, pressed a weapon into his hand, and taught him that power was the only language the world would never stop speaking. The man whose car had burned on a Seoul overpass 5 years ago, whose funeral Ye Yun had attended in the cold, whose grave he had stood beside with his hands clasped behind his back and his face arranged into the only expression he'd known how to produce at the time, controlled, dry, and utterly unreadable. The grave was theater. 5 years of operating from the shadows, 5 years of watching, manipulating, positioning. The 4 men turned against Ye Yun in that safehouse were not rogue. They were recruited, patiently and precisely, by someone who had spent 2 decades learning exactly which pressure points inside Ye Yun's organization would yield. The poison in his morning coffee was not the beginning of Jin's patience. It was simply the part that had finally surfaced. Ye Yun set the tablet down. He was quiet for a long time. Ruth didn't fill the silence. She understood it by instinct and proximity and the particular education of having watched him closely for 18 months. She moved from the table to the platform and sat beside him, close enough that their arms touched, and said nothing at all. The tremor reached his shoulder. He let it. After a while, the weight of it, the poison, the betrayal, the specific agony of a father's hand on the knife, became too much for a vertical spine. He lowered himself without announcing it, and his head came to rest in her lap with the quiet surrender of a man who had run out of positions to defend from. Ruth's hand moved to his hair, slowly, without hesitation. Her fingers traced through it with a tenderness so unguarded it was almost unbearable. The touch of someone who was done pretending she didn't feel what she felt, in a room where no performance was required from either of them. "If I don't make it out of this," Ye Yun said to the amber-lit ceiling, his voice stripped of everything decorative, "I will spend whatever hours I have left making certain Jin doesn't either." Ruth's hand stilled for just a moment. "You'll make it," she said. Not a comfort, a declaration. He turned his head just enough to look up at her, her dark face above him, the bruise on her cheek, the absolute, uncompromising certainty in her eyes, and something in his expression shifted. Past possession, past obsession, into something quieter and far more permanent. "You," he said simply, "before Jin, before soul, before any of it, I get you out first." Ruth looked down at him for a long moment. The amber light held them both. Outside, Soul kept bleeding neon into the rain, indifferent and infinite, and the stabilizer kept counting down toward the moment the poison would reclaim what it was owed. Ruth didn't sleep. She hadn't slept since the safehouse, and her body knew better than to ask. While Ye Yun rested, not peacefully, but with the heavy, medicated stillness of a man whose nervous system was rationing its resources, she sat at the low table with the field tablet, her dark eyes moving through intercepted communications with the focused economy of someone who had spent years learning to find the signal buried inside the noise. Jin's network was sophisticated, layered, built with the arrogance of a man who believed himself permanently dead and therefore permanently safe, but arrogance always left a thread. She found his at 4:17 in the morning, a routing signature embedded in a financial transfer that matched a comm protocol she'd flagged in her NIS files 8 months ago and never been able to source. She pulled it, then pulled the layer beneath it, then the one beneath that. By 5, she had the full architecture of Jin's operation spread across her screen like an anatomy chart, and every organ of it was wrong. She crossed the room and woke Ye Yun with her hand on his arm. His eyes opened immediately, trained reflexes that sleep couldn't fully dismantle, and he read her expression before she spoke a single word. He sat up. Chloe Sterling had not chosen any of this. The intelligence was unambiguous. Jin had identified the Sterling merger as the perfect mechanism 18 months ago, simultaneous to Ruth's placement in the estate, which meant he had known about the NER's investigation and moved to exploit it. He had located Chloe's younger sister, a 23-year-old graduate student named Maya, and had her extracted from her London flat with the efficiency of a man who had been running disappearances since before Ye Yun could read. Maya had been held in an underground facility in Seoul's outer district ever since. The instructions delivered to Chloe were simple and absolute. Proceed with the engagement, proceed with the wedding, and upon Ye Yun's inevitable medical decline, sign the asset transfer documents that would dissolve his empire into Jin's offshore holdings. Deviate in any direction, and Maya would not be returned in a condition that permitted recovery. Ye Yun read every word without expression. Then he set the tablet down and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. "She was sitting across from me for 7 months, he said quietly, attending dinners, discussing distribution networks, terrified, and I dismissed her with 4 words and never looked back." A beat. The muscle in his jaw worked once. Jin built it that way. He knew I wouldn't look closer. "He knew you'd see exactly what he wanted you to see," Ruth said. "A cold transaction." He dressed her in it deliberately. The acknowledgement settled something. He picked the tablet back up. The second layer of intelligence was worse. The American wedding, the ceremony currently being dismantled by the FBI, pursuant to the anonymous tip Ruth had routed through a dead-drop NIS channel before the safehouse, had never been the objective. It was scenery. While law enforcement focused its surveillance resources on a 400-guest event in Manhattan, Jin's people had moved a stolen EMP device through Ye Yun's own Seoul port infrastructure. The device was military-grade. Korean Defense Ministry reported missing from a transport convoy in Gyeonggi Province 11 days ago. Its detonation radius, calibrated for maximum atmospheric disruption at the coordinates of Seoul's central financial district, would collapse every digitally dependent system in the city simultaneously: banking, communications, emergency services, transit. The kind of chaos inside which empires changed hands before anyone knew a transfer had occurred. The device was currently aboard a freighter sitting in Ye Yun's port. Jin's freighter, Jin's men, Jin's detonation window, opening in 19 hours. Ruth watched Ye Yun process this, watched the cold, total reorganization of a tactical mind absorbing a threat at maximum scale. His left hand rested on the table. The tremor had returned to his fingers, a fine oscillation he controlled by pressing his palm flat against the surface. The stabilizer was narrowing toward its limit. She covered his hand with hers without thinking. He looked down at their hands, then up at her face, at the quiet ferocity in her eyes, the rope marks still faintly visible on her wrists, the set of her jaw that told him she had already run the calculations and arrived at the same destination he had. "The antidote," she said. "Everything in that data drive confirms it. Jin synthesized it himself. There is no other existing sample, no laboratory with the compound, no secondary source." Her fingers pressed more firmly against the back of his hand. "He carries it on his person, a vial, his insurance that you would never be able to eliminate him without eliminating your own cure." The silence that followed had genuine weight. To stop the EMP, they had to reach the freighter. To get the antidote, they had to go through Jin. And Ye Yun had hours of functional capacity left in a nervous system already conducting a systematic retreat. He looked at her for a long moment. The amber light had softened with approaching dawn, the first grey suggestion of morning pressing through the reinforced screens, washing the room into something quieter, more honest. Ruth! Her name in his mouth always landed differently than any other word he spoke. Lower, more deliberate, like he was placing it somewhere specific and meant for it to stay. "Whatever happens on that ship," he said, "you stay within arm's reach of me. Not protocol distance, not operative distance." His hand turned beneath hers and closed around her fingers. "Mine." It was not a romantic declaration. It was a territorial one, delivered by a man who had accepted that the only thing on earth he was unwilling to lose was sitting across from him in the grey Seoul dawn, looking at him like she intended to carry him out of this alive through sheer refusal to accept any other outcome. Ruth held his gaze, held his hand. "Then let's go take back your port," she said. "If you've made it this far without your pulse spiking, check your pulse. This story is only getting darker. Hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter. Drop a comment below. Did you see Jin coming, or did that betrayal blindside you completely? We'll see you on that freighter." The freighter Shenlong sat black against a blacker ocean, its hull swallowing the horizon whole. No lights on the upper deck, no mercy in the air. Ye Yun crouched at the bow of the rigid inflatable, his jaw set, his eyes cataloguing every shadow that moved across the ship's rusted belly. Rain came down in curtains, not the gentle kind that makes poets sentimental, but the brutal, punishing kind that strips skin of warmth and reminds a man exactly how small he is against the world. He didn't flinch. He never did. Ruth crouched beside him. She was no longer the woman in the white maid's uniform who had moved silently through marble corridors with a lowered gaze and careful hands. The woman beside him now wore black tactical gear that fit her like a second skin, form-fitting, deliberate, unforgiving. Her locks were bound tight against the nape of her neck. Her deep brown skin caught the distant flicker of the ship's emergency beacon, and for one unguarded second, Ye Yun looked at her the way a man looks at something he cannot afford to lose. She caught him looking. "Focus," she said quietly, her voice steady beneath the roar of the sea. He turned away, but the image burned. They scaled the hull in silence. magnetized grips against cold steel, bodies pressed flat against the rain-slicked surface, moving with the kind of coordination that isn't taught. It's built through shared danger, shared survival, through the intimacy of trusting someone with your life so many times that the line between protection and possession begins to blur beyond recognition. Inside, the freighter smelled of salt, rust, and something chemical, sharp and synthetic beneath the decay. The corridors were narrow arteries, barely wide enough for two. They moved in formation, Ye Yun forward, Ruth a breath behind, her eyes sweeping rearward with a vigilance that matched his own. The first guard never heard a thing. Ye Yun moved like shadow given muscle, one fluid motion, one final exhale from the man, and silence reclaimed the corridor. Ruth didn't look away. She'd stopped flinching at his violence weeks ago, not because she'd grown numb, but because she understood now what it cost him. Every kill was a transaction. He paid for it in something she couldn't name. They descended 2 levels, following the intelligence she'd extracted from Jin's personal communications, memorized, not written down. Her mind was her greatest weapon, and Ye Yun had stopped pretending otherwise. Then a second guard flanked them from a junction, and Ruth moved first. Clean, precise. She disarmed him with the efficiency of training buried deep beneath years of performance, the careful act of appearing smaller than she was. The guard hit the flooded floor with a hollow splash. Ye Yun stared at her. "Later," she said, reading his expression without looking at him. "Later." He filed it away like everything else about her. They were 30 meters from the cargo hold, 30 meters from Jin's leverage, from the evidence that would burn his operation to the waterline, when Ye Yun's body collected its debt. It started in his chest, a sudden compression, as though something invisible had closed a fist around his lungs. The stabilizer had run its course. The neurotoxin, no longer held at arm's length, moved through him with the confidence of something that had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. His legs followed. He went to one knee. Water soaked through immediately, ice cold against his skin. His vision tunneled at the edges. He heard Ruth before he saw her, the sharp pivot of her boots, the splash of her movement, then her hands, warm against his face, forcing his eyes to hers. Her face was rain-drenched, her dark eyes blazing with something that had long since moved past concern into something fiercer. The rope marks on her wrists caught the dim corridor light as she gripped him. She was holding his life in her hands, and she knew it, and she refused to let go. "Look at me," she commanded, soft and absolute at once. He looked. "I didn't burn my life down," she said, each word a struck match, "to watch you die in a flooded corridor on a ghost ship. Get up." Something moved behind his eyes. He rose, not because the poison released him, not because his body remembered how to function. He rose because she was still holding his face, and the distance between them had collapsed into something that had everything to do with the terrifying, irreversible truth that this woman had become the reason his survival instinct still bothered to fight. She dropped her hands first, stepped back, raised her weapon toward the corridor ahead. He watched the line of her jaw, the controlled rise and fall of her shoulders beneath the soaked tactical vest. 30 meters, she said quietly. 30 meters, he agreed. They moved forward together, the ocean raging against the hull around them, the ship groaning beneath their feet like something alive and wounded. And between them, unspoken, devastating, the slow recognition that whatever this was, it had already gone too far to call it anything but what it was. Neither said it. They didn't need to. The cargo hold swallowed them whole. It was cavernous, a cathedral built for contraband, where the ceilings disappeared into shadow and the walls wept condensation in slow, deliberate trails. Shipping containers stacked 3 high formed a brutal skyline in miniature. The air tasted of machine oil, brine, and the rot that accumulates when power has been exercised in a space long enough to leave a stain. Jin stood at the center of it. He was older than Ye Yun had allowed himself to remember, silver at his temples, the kind that comes not from age but from decades spent orchestrating other people's suffering. He wore a tailored charcoal suit with the ease of a man who considered elegance a weapon. Around his neck, suspended on a fine platinum chain, A glass vial glowed faintly amber in the dim hold lighting. The antidote, small enough to crush in a fist, priceless enough to kill for. He smiled when Ye Yun stepped into the light. "You look terrible," Jin said pleasantly. "You look exactly the same," Ye Yun replied. "That's always been your problem." Behind Ye Yun, the sound of boots, 4 mercenaries materializing from between the containers, cutting off the exit. Ruth moved instinctively to his flank, but 2 of them were already on her, wrenching her arms back, slamming her against a container wall with a resonant clang that echoed through the hold like a struck bell. Ye Yun didn't turn, but every muscle in his body locked. "A maid," Jin said, his gaze traveling to Ruth with the dismissive appraisal of a man who assigned value to people the way others assigned value to furniture. "You, who could have had dynasties, brought a maid to your reckoning." He tilted his head. "Tell me, is it sentiment? Or did you simply run out of people willing to follow you into suicide?" The hold settled into silence, except for the ocean's violence against the hull. "My empire," Ye Yun said quietly, "was never built on fear." He took 1 step forward. "You could never understand that. You required terror to maintain loyalty. I required only trust." Another step. His body was betraying him, the poison moving through his blood like something with intention. But his voice was a still lake. "Every man who ever stood beside me chose to. Not one of yours ever had that choice." Jin's smile thinned. Then the blade appeared, long, single-edged, military grade, and the conversation ended. Jin moved with a speed that contradicted his composed exterior. The first slash opened Ye Yun's forearm before he'd fully drawn his own knife. He barely felt it. The poison had already begun numbing the borders between pain and sensation, which was a mercy and a danger in equal measure. They circled. From her position against the container, Ruth watched with eyes that were doing everything her restrained hands could not, tracking every exchange, calculating, refusing to surrender to helplessness, even while physically pinned. A cut had opened along her jaw from the impact with the steel wall, a thin line of dark against her deep brown skin. She didn't make a sound. The fight was nothing like cinema, no choreography, no beauty. It was close and ugly and intimate in the way only blade work can be. 2 men in each other's breath, each seeking the single opening that ends everything. Jin was precise, trained. He landed a second hit along Ye Yun's ribs, and Ye Yun felt that one, warmth spreading beneath his shirt in a way that confirmed depth. His knee buckled briefly. Jin saw it, pressed forward with the confidence of a man watching a bet pay out. "There it is," Jin murmured, almost gentle. "My poison, my timeline. Even now, you're fighting my design." Ye Yun straightened. He looked at Ruth. Just once. Just a glance. A single point of contact across the brutal geometry of the hold. Her eyes were steady on his, and inside them was not grief or fear, but something blazing and furious, and completely ungovernable. Something that said, "I see you. I'm here. Don't you dare." It moved through him like a current finding ground. When Jin stepped inside his guard to deliver what he had already decided was the finishing blow, Ye Yun didn't retreat. He turned into it, accepted the burn of the blade grazing his shoulder, and brought his own knife upward in a single precise arc beneath Jin's jaw. The carotid. Jin's eyes registered something that might, in another life, have been surprise. The vial swung forward on its chain as his knees found the floor, catching the light one last time. Amber, luminous, impossibly small for everything it represented. Ye Yun caught it before Jin finished falling. The hold went quiet. Even the ocean seemed to pause. He stood there breathing, chest heaving, blood tracking down his arm, his side, pooling in the grooves of the steel floor. The mercenaries, reading the arithmetic of the room, made the only rational calculation available to men without a paymaster, and the sounds of their retreat echoed up through the corridor. Then Ruth was there. She crossed the hold in long strides, her locks loose now from the fight, her deep brown skin gleaming with rain and exertion, the cut along her jaw catching the dim light. She didn't speak. She reached him first with her hands, checking his arm, his side, her touch efficient and furious, and devastatingly careful all at once, as though her fingers hadn't yet decided whether they were a medic's or something else entirely. He let her. "The vial," she finally said. He placed it in her palm, closed her fingers around it with both of his hands, held them there a moment longer than necessary. The ship groaned around them, the ocean pressed against the hull, and in the cathedral of Jin's collapsed empire, with blood on the floor and the antidote finally theirs, something between them shifted irrevocably, past the point of pretending, past the careful architecture of distance they'd both constructed, and both, privately, already begun to mourn. The terminal screen was the only clean light left in the world. Ruth reached it first, her fingers finding the keyboard with the muscle memory of someone who had spent months learning the architecture of Jin's operation from the inside out. Every system, every failsafe, every vulnerability dressed up as infrastructure. The EMP device was nested 3 levels below them in the ship's belly, its countdown rendered in clinical green digits on the screen. 58 seconds. She worked fast. Her dark fingers moved across the terminal, with a precision that had nothing to do with panic and everything to do with the cold, focused place she retreated to when the stakes became unsurvivable. Ye Yun stood at her back, bleeding steadily, watching the corridor and her in equal measure. "Tell me you can stop it," he said. A pause, the kind that answers before words do. "I can't stop it," Ruth said. Her voice was even, terrifyingly even. "The detonation sequence is hardware locked. There's no remote abort." Her eyes moved across the screen, reading architecture the way others read faces. "But I can scuttle the ship, send the EMP to the bottom of the ocean before it fires. The pressure at that depth will neutralize it completely." 41 seconds. "Ruth, the hull breach initiates in 30 seconds once I trigger it." She turned to look at him then, fully, completely, her dark eyes holding his without flinching. Her locks were plastered to her neck and jaw. The cut along her jaw had dried to a thin, dark line. She was the most devastatingly composed person he had ever watched make a decision about her own death. "We'll be trapped inside." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps. "Then we find another way." "There isn't one." She held his gaze. "I've already looked." 29 seconds. He stared at her. The man who had built an empire on contingencies, on always having an exit, on never being cornered, stood cornered, and looked at this woman who had walked into his world as something disposable and become, somewhere between the marble floors and the flooded corridors, and the moment she'd pulled him upright, with nothing but her voice, entirely irreplaceable. "Do it," he said. She turned back to the terminal and entered the sequence. The sound the hull made when it breached was not an explosion. It was deeper, a tectonic groan, a tearing that seemed to come from the ocean itself, as though the sea had simply decided it was done waiting. The floor tilted, the lights died, and then the water came, not a trickle, not a surge, but a wall, black and freezing, pouring through the lower junction with the indifferent force of something that has never once considered mercy. Darkness swallowed the hold entirely. Ruth reached for the wall and found Ye Yun's hand instead. He gripped it without hesitation, without calculation, the reflex of a man who had finally stopped pretending he had a choice about her. The water hit their ankles, their shins. It was cold, in a way that rewrote the body's understanding of cold. Not temperature, but erasure, stripping sensation down to the single imperative of survival. Ye Yun pulled the vial from his jacket with his free hand, bit the seal, and swallowed the antidote in the dark. He felt nothing immediately. But somewhere in the architecture of his blood, something that had been closing began, incrementally, to open. The water reached their waists. "The torpedo tube," Ruth said, her voice close to his ear, her breath warm against the cold. "Starboard side, 30 feet. You memorized the schematics." "I memorized everything about this ship the moment you told me we'd be on it. A beat. I memorize everything I need to survive." He pulled her closer, not gently, not tentatively, but with the unambiguous certainty of a man who has located the one thing in a sinking world worth holding on to. His arm encircled her, And she let him, her free hand finding the front of his jacket, the power dynamic that had defined every interaction between them, simply, finally, gone, washed out by freezing water and the stripping truth of imminent death. They were not boss and subordinate, not captor and captive, not obsession and its object. They were a man and a woman, chest deep in black water, fighting to stay alive together. "You are my only empire now," he said against her temple. Quiet, absolute. The kind of statement that doesn't ask for a response because it isn't looking for one. It's simply the truth, relocated at last, from wherever he'd been hiding it. Ruth closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then, swim. The water closed over their heads as they dove, freezing, lightless, the ship groaning its final complaint around them. 30 feet of submerged corridor, navigated by memory and touch, and the desperate logic of two people who had decided, without negotiating it, that they were getting out together or not at all. The torpedo tube was exactly where she said it would be. They pushed through into open ocean simultaneously, the cold hitting like a verdict, the surface a distant shimmer above them. They kicked upward together, his hand still locked in hers, her lokes fanning around her in the dark water like something luminous. They broke the surface, gasping. Behind them, 50 meters and descending, the Shen Long surrendered to the Pacific with a sound like the end of an era. A long, resonant moan, then silence, then nothing but the rain and the waves and the two of them, treading water in the dark, alive. Ruth turned to look at him. Salt water tracked down the planes of her face, the cut on her jaw, the fire still burning behind her eyes, the expression of someone who has survived something they weren't certain they would, and hasn't yet decided what to do with that fact. He looked back at her the same way. Neither spoke. The ocean held them both, and for once, it was enough. The world buried them quietly. No funeral, no monument, just a brief notation in intelligence files that would be classified within the hour. 2 names, 1 freighter, the Pacific Ocean, and the cold bureaucratic shorthand for presumed dead. The Sterling family's legal architecture collapsed 11 days later, dismantled floor by floor as Ruth's RICO files moved through federal hands like a lit fuse. Every account, every shell company, every name that had ever written a check to buy someone else's silence. The FBI called it the most comprehensive organized crime filing in a decade. Ruth had built it over 18 months, 1 document at a time, in the margins of a life she'd borrowed from a dead woman's identity. She had also, in the final hours before the freighter went down, embedded Maya's precise location, the coordinates of Jin's separate holding facility in Seoul's outer district, directly into the RICO package. Federal agents reached the facility within 6 hours of the filing. Maya Sterling came home on a Thursday. Ruth received the single-word confirmation on a burner phone she destroyed immediately afterward. She sat with the information for a long moment in the Mediterranean sunlight, and then she let herself feel it, fully, without armoring against it, the specific ache of a mission, completed at a cost she was still calculating. Her NAS file had been formally closed 2 weeks prior. No hearing, no debrief, just a terse administrative notation, operative non-recoverable, case resolved, from a handler who understood that some agents don't come back from deep cover because deep cover, done long enough, becomes the only life that still makes sense. Ruth had made 1 call before destroying her last agency phone. She had said 3 sentences. Then she had ended it, and she had not looked back. The villa existed on a hillside above the sea, accessible only by a road so narrow it appeared on no map that mattered. White stone, terracotta tiles weathered to the color of old amber, bougainvillea rioting in violent pink cascades over every surface that would hold it. The kind of place that seemed to exist outside of time, where the light arrived differently than anywhere else, golden and unhurried, touching everything with the democratic tenderness of something that has no agenda. It was nothing like where they had been. That was the point. Ye Yun moved through his recovery without complaint, without performance. The antidote had done its work, but the poison had left marks, a fatigue that lived in his bones rather than his muscles, a sensitivity to cold that hadn't existed before. He moved through it the same way he moved through everything, by continuing. The weeks of healing had stripped him of the armor that power provides. She had watched it happen, the gradual unwinding of the man who controlled rooms by existing in them, replaced by something quieter and considerably more dangerous, because it was real. His tattoos mapped his history across his shoulders and chest in dark ink, symbols she had learned the meaning of one evening when the sun was setting and he was finally still enough to let her ask. He had answered every question. That, more than anything, had undone her. Ruth was no longer performing anything. The maid was gone. The operative was filed away with the burned phones and the discarded identities. What remained was the woman underneath all of it, the one who had always been there, watching from behind every role she'd ever played, waiting to find out if there was a life on the other side worth stepping into. She was finding out. She stood on the villa's upper terrace one evening as the sun descended into the sea, with the slow, deliberate drama of something that knows it's being watched. Her locks were loose, falling past her shoulders, the salt air lifting them at the ends. Her deep brown skin was unmarked now, luminous in the amber light, unhurried, unburdened. She had the stillness of a woman who has been in enough danger to recognize its absence, and has chosen, consciously, to inhabit peace rather than simply wait for the next threat. She heard him before she saw him. He came to stand beside her, close enough that his arm pressed against hers along the terrace railing, unhurried, certain, the way he occupied space near her now, fully healed, fully present. He smelled of warm linen and the sea. They watched the horizon together in silence for a long time. Then his hand found hers on the railing, and he turned toward her with the expression she had catalogued over months and never quite permitted herself to name, the one that appeared only when he thought she wasn't looking, and had begun, recently, appearing even when she was. "You're thinking about her," he said. "Maya." He always knew. "She's home," Ruth said. "Because of you." She turned to look at him then. Really look. The way she'd disciplined herself against for so long, because some thresholds, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. His dark eyes held hers with a steadiness that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with the complete and irreversible surrender of a man who has stopped fighting the most significant defeat of his life. He reached for her slowly, one hand rising to her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone, the place that had been damaged and was now healed and was now simply hers again, as though he were reading something written there in a language only he had ever bothered to learn. She didn't pull back. She had stopped pulling back. His lips found the small scar at her temple first, the one from a mission 2 years before him, a life he'd had no part in, a wound she'd never explained. He didn't ask. He simply pressed his mouth to it, with a reverence that made her breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with being truly, completely seen. "You were my phantom," he murmured against her skin, his voice low, unhurried, stripped of every performance the world had ever required from him. "Everywhere in my house, everywhere in my mind." He pulled back just enough to look at her. "But now, don't," she whispered. Not a refusal, a request for him to mean it. "Now you are my reality." His forehead came to rest against hers. "The only one I have any interest in." The sun finished its descent. The sea caught the last of the light and held it briefly. Gold, dissolving into deep, luminous blue. Ruth closed the remaining distance herself. And the Mediterranean night, warm and infinite, and entirely unconcerned with the darkness that had preceded it, gathered them both in without a word. If the dangerous, intoxicating world of Ye Yun and Ruth left your pulse unsteady, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. New dark romance chapters drop every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next. Did you see every betrayal coming? Or did this story catch you off guard? Tell us your favorite twist in the comments below. Like, share, and come back to the shadows with us. We'll be waiting.